There are ancient records that scholars acknowledge. There are myths that historians tolerate. And then there are texts that do not fit anywhere. Documents so anomalous, so disruptive, that the safest response has always been to declare them symbolic, metaphorical, or simply wrong. Among these outliers, one artifact stands above all others. A clay tablet cracked by time, pulled from the mud of southern Mesopotamia, etched with a list of kings whose reigns stretch across tens of thousands of years. A document so unsettling that even to read it with an open mind is to challenge the entire architecture of human history. This is the Sumerian King List. Before we venture any deeper into this labyrinth of forgotten history, take a moment to settle in with us. Let us know in the comments where and when you're listening from. It's always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. And as always, every visual you see here serves only to help set the atmosphere. The real journey lies in the ideas, the clues, and the mysteries themselves. Your support helps keep this exploration alive, and we're grateful you're here. At first glance, it appears simple, a chronological record of rulers and the cities they governed. But then the numbers strike you. One king rules for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, a third for 43,200. These are not errors where a scribe misplaced a digit or repeated a line. These extreme figures appear consistently across multiple copies found centuries apart. The deeper you look, the more impossible the document becomes. The list names cities: Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, said to have ruled in an age before the flood. An era that, according to mainstream anthropology, predates civilization itself, where humans were supposedly scattered hunter-gatherers, not builders of organized cities with kings, temples, and laws. But the King List tells a different story. It describes a world that had already known city life, kingship, technological order, and complex administration long before the time we call history. And then, in a single sentence, everything ends. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no explanation, no attempt to clarify whether this was a natural disaster, a divine punishment, or something else entirely. It reads as though the original authors assumed everyone would remember what had happened, as though the flood was not a myth, but an event so catastrophic, so universally known, that no detail was necessary. Yet the most perplexing mystery is not the impossible rain lengths or the mention of a cataclysm. It is the geography. Because the King List does not present its cities randomly. It arranges them in a sequence that behaves like a map that does not align with the landscape we know today. Eridu exists, yes. Shuruppak exists, but others seem displaced, recorded at locations that either cannot support cities today or are radically different from their ancient descriptions. Some appear where there is now desert, others where a river once flowed but no longer does. Still others correspond to areas that evidence suggests may have been submerged or reshaped by catastrophic flooding. This raises a dangerous possibility that the world described in the King List was not our world as we know it, that these were cities on a landscape altered by an event so massive that coastlines, rivers, and entire regions were permanently transformed. If true, then archaeology today is digging in the wrong places, using the wrong assumptions, and ignoring a version of Earth that no longer exists. If that sounds extreme, consider this. No one knows who wrote the first version of the King List. No one knows where its information originally came from. All surviving copies are much younger than the events they claim to describe. This suggests that the list may itself be the remnant of an even older record, an inheritance from a civilization that endured the flood and attempted to preserve fragments of its memory. Some researchers propose harmless interpretations. They call the text political propaganda or symbolic mythology, but others dare to ask the question that many academics find threatening. What if these records are not metaphors? What if a civilization did exist before the flood? One with cities, administration, advanced knowledge, engineering, and rulers who were remembered not because their lifespans were literal, but because they presided over epochs, long periods of stability before the world as they knew it was erased. This theory gains traction when one pays attention to the opening line of the King List. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Mainstream interpretations dismiss this as mythological language, but if we take it at face value, it suggests something profound, that the system of governance or the knowledge required to build the first city came from outside the local population, not necessarily from gods, but perhaps from a separate group, a surviving remnant of a previous age with knowledge far beyond that of the surrounding people. The more one examines the context, the harder it becomes to escape the sense that the King List is not a creation myth, but a historical echo, a fossilized memory, a fragment of a world wiped out so thoroughly that only myths remained. Why would such a world be forgotten? Perhaps because it ended abruptly, perhaps because only a few survived, perhaps because the trauma was so intense that survivors reduced history to legend, or perhaps because later civilizations had no framework to understand what they inherited, so they reshaped it into metaphor. Yet the list survived, through invasions, droughts, fires, and collapses, through the fall of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, through the rise of empires that had no idea what the tablets they stored truly represented. And against all odds, after thousands of years, it reached us. And now we stand at a crossroads. Either the King List is meaningless, an impossible document full of fantasy, or it is a clue, a key to a forgotten epoch, a guide to lost cities buried under millennia of shifting geography and political turmoil. But maps only matter if we follow them. And the first destination this ancient list gives us is a city scholars call the cradle of civilization, Eridu, a place where the first temple rose, a place tied to gods, knowledge, water, and creation, a place whose ruins may hold the oldest memories of humanity's true beginnings. If we want to understand the world before the flood, that is where we must begin. And all threads of this forgotten age, its kings, its myths, its impossible spans of time, lead back to a single place. A city whispered about in the oldest strata of human memory, a city the ancients believed was not merely the first, but the foundation of everything that came after. To follow the trail of the antediluvian world, we must return to that cradle on the edge of ancient marshes, Eridu, the first city, where the story of civilization, or the shadow of an even older one, first took shape. Long before long before Babylon, long before the empires that shaped our textbooks, there was one name, always placed first, always spoken with reverence, always associated with beginnings, Eridu. To scholars, Eridu is often described as the earliest city in Mesopotamia, an archaeological site composed of layered temples, mud brick foundations, and traces of early settlement. But to the Sumerians, who lived thousands of years closer to the origins of human civilization, Eridu was something very different. It was not merely the first city, it was the place where civilization itself was brought into the world. The King List states it plainly. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was at Eridu. While, why Eridu? Why not Uruk, the great metropolis of the ancient world? Why not Nippur, the religious center? Something about Eridu, something ancient, something primordial, made the early Sumerians believe it was the birthplace of everything. And when archaeologists began excavating the site in the 1940s, they encountered something strange. Eridu did not simply appear as a small village that expanded over time. Instead, it seemed to have been established from the beginning as a significant ritual and administrative center. Its earliest temple, known as the House of the Waters, was already monumental compared to the scattered huts typical of that era. Layer after layer, the city revealed a pattern, not of gradual cultural development, but of planned reconstruction. Thousands of years of continuous rebuilding on the same sacred spot, as if its importance had been understood since the moment of its creation. But there was a deeper mystery hidden beneath the soil. Eridu was built on a landscape that today is dry, cracked, and windswept. Yet the ancient texts constantly associate Eridu with water, sacred water, deep water, the primeval ocean from which creation emerged. According to Sumerian mythology, Eridu was the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, whose domain was the abyss beneath the earth. And it is here that archaeology begins to overlap with mythology in a way few dare to acknowledge. Core samples taken from beneath the city show evidence that Eridu was once surrounded by a vast wetland, fed by channels of the Euphrates. But the curious part is this: the earliest phases of the city appear to have been constructed on ground that had previously been underwater, as if the first inhabitants had chosen a site emerging from a receding floodplain, or, more provocatively, a place that had survived a flood. Some researchers have quietly whispered that Eridu may not simply be the first city, it may be the first city after something. A foundation laid on the ruins or remnants of a world washed away. The sediments tell a fractured story. Layers of occupation, layers of silt, layers of construction, layers of sudden abandonment. At certain strata, the city seems to pause, as if interrupted by environmental upheaval, then re-emerge with renewed energy and new architectural forms. These cycles align uncomfortably well with local flood events and broader climatic shifts. But the King List places the earliest rulers of Eridu in a period long before any of these dated floods. It insists that Eridu existed in what the Sumerians called the antediluvian age, the time before the Great Flood. In that era, kings reigned for extraordinary spans of time. Their influence stretched across epochs, and their cities, especially Eridu, were portrayed not as human settlements, but as centres of divine knowledge. When researchers excavated the oldest temple complex at Eridu, they discovered signs of advanced ritual design, standardized bricks, symmetrical layouts, and water channels integrated into the architecture. For a society supposedly on the cusp of settling down and farming, these features are startling. They point to a level of planning and organisation that should not have existed. The standard archaeological narrative explains this as the first flowering of urbanisation. But the King List suggests something different. It implies that Eridu was not the origin of civilization. It was the recipient of civilization. The question then becomes, from whom? Mainstream archaeology attributes the city's development to cultural evolution within the region, but alternative interpretations suggest the city may have preserved inherited knowledge, techniques passed down from survivors of an earlier catastrophe. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented their own civilization. They insisted it had been bestowed upon them. Eridu, in their worldview, was the place where this transfer occurred. In the temple foundations, some archaeologists noted anomalies, unusual stone placements, foreign materials, and construction techniques that do not match later Sumerian traditions. These inconsistencies may be nothing, or they may be echoes of builders who were not Sumerian at all. The King List subtly hints at this by distinguishing the earliest rulers from later ones. The first kings are described as belonging to the antediluvian age. Only after the flood does the list speak of kings who resemble ordinary humans. This creates a narrative divide, one that archaeologists have largely ignored, but which the ancients took very seriously. There was a world before the flood, and a world after. Eridu stands at the threshold between these two ages. Its ruins preserve traces of both, layered in mud and baked brick. When viewed through this lens, the city becomes less a birthplace and more a monument, a memorial to knowledge salvaged from destruction. a signpost pointing backward to a time for which there are no surviving records, only myths, fragments, and a list of kings whose ages defy belief. Some researchers, working quietly outside academic circles, have proposed that the earliest layer of Eridu could be significantly older than current estimates suggest. Dating mud brick is notoriously difficult. Organic material is sparse. Disturbance layers complicate analysis. And in regions like southern Iraq, erosion has wiped away vast amounts of evidence. It is entirely possible that the earth beneath Eridu hides a chapter of human history much deeper than we currently acknowledge. The King List certainly thinks so. It locates the first kings here, not in cities with abundant archaeological remains, but in a single place that seems to carry the echoes of a forgotten age. Whether we interpret these echoes as literal history, symbolic memory, or traces of a lost civilization, one thing is certain. Eridu was the cornerstone. And if the cornerstone is older than we believe, then the entire structure of human history must be reconsidered. Yet Eridu is only the beginning. The King List names 8 antediluvian cities. If the first one raises questions, the others deepen them, because not all of them have been found, and some, disturbingly, seem to be located in places where cities should not exist at all. We turn to Bad-tibira and the other pre-flood cities, settlements described as centres of metallurgy, knowledge, and power long before such capabilities should have existed. Are these merely legends, or are they fragments of a world erased by time? If Eridu was the cradle, the point where kingship descended and civilization began, then the next city in the King List, Bad-tibira, is where the story takes an unexpected and troubling turn. Because while Eridu is mysterious, Bad-tibira is almost anachronistic, a city that should not exist in the time period described, associated with skills and technologies that humanity was not supposed to possess for thousands of years. Its name in Sumerian is commonly interpreted as the place of metalworking or fortress of the metalworkers, and that is precisely where the mystery begins. According to the King List, the earliest rulers presided over Bad-tibira during the antediluvian age, an era traditionally aligned with the Neolithic or even late Stone Age. Yet the very identity of the city is tied to metallurgy, an art that mainstream archaeology claims emerged much later. How can a Stone Age world have a city named for metal production? The conventional explanation is that these references are symbolic, part of a mythologized narrative. But the King List does not describe Bad-tibira symbolically. It lists it matter-of-factly, alongside the names of real cities and rulers. And more importantly, the myths of the region are unusually consistent in portraying Bad-tibira as a center of industry, crafting, and advanced knowledge. According to Sumerian traditions, the city was ruled by Dumuzid the shepherd and later by Enmenlu-Ana, 2 figures associated with extraordinary lifespans. Dumuzid is described as a being connected to agriculture, fertility, and animal husbandry, but also, curiously, with creation myths involving advanced tools and sacred artistry. These associations have led some researchers to wonder whether the legends preserve fragments of genuine historical memory, echoes of a community with unexpectedly refined skills. But the deeper problem is this: we cannot confidently locate Bad-tibira today. Unlike Eridu, whose location is confirmed, Bad-tibira exists in a haze of competing hypotheses. Archaeologists have proposed several sites: Tel al-Madineh, Tel al-Uhaymir, Tel Jida, but none fit perfectly. Some are too young, others too small. Some contain the remains of cities built long after the period described in the King List. Others show signs of destruction or burial inconsistent with the timeline. Why does the second city in the world's oldest historical document remain elusive? One compelling answer is geological. The entire region where the earlier cities once stood has shifted dramatically over time. Rivers changed course. floods buried settlements under meters of silt. Portions of southern Iraq sank gradually due to changes in water tables and sediment deposition. And if the region experienced a massive cataclysm, as the King List, Mesopotamian myths, and global flood legends all suggest, many ancient settlements could be buried far deeper than archaeologists expect. In core samples taken from the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, researchers have found signs of submerged landscapes, ancient canal systems, and even faint outlines of large structures. But excavation is difficult. The ground is unstable, shifting, and in many areas waterlogged. Political turmoil only adds to the complications. Entire stretches of land that could conceal early urban centres remain inaccessible. And so Bad-tibira lingers as a phantom, a city said to have existed at the dawn of time, remembered by ancient scribes, but stubbornly refusing to appear in the archaeological record. But there is a pattern emerging here, one that becomes clearer the more we follow the King List. The antediluvian cities are not only old, they are anomalous. They possess qualities inconsistent with the expected capabilities of their time. They appear in places that do not fully align with present-day geography. And they leave behind traditions suggesting advanced knowledge that appears too early, too sudden, too fully formed. Bad-tibira, for instance, is closely connected with the mythological figure Enki, the deity associated with wisdom, engineering, and the organization of civilization. In some versions of the myths, Enki is said to have established workshops there, places where divine craftsmen forged tools, weapons, and sacred objects. To the Sumerians, these stories were religious, but viewed through a different lens, they raise questions. Why would a primitive society imagine its earliest city as a center of metallurgy and technical skill? One theory proposes that the myths reflect memories of real craftsmanship carried out by survivors of a prior age. The concept of metallurgy in this interpretation does not refer to industrial-scale smelting, but to symbolic mastery of tools, materials, and construction techniques inherited from a vanished culture. The followers of Enki, priests, engineers, knowledge keepers, may have preserved techniques that appeared miraculous to later generations. Another intriguing hypothesis connects Bad-tibira to a broader network of early settlements. Some ancient sources describe it as part of a chain of cities aligned along routes that no longer exist, routes that match pre-Holocene coastlines or riverbeds. If this is true, then Bad-tibira may be buried beneath terrain reworked entirely by post-flood geological processes. Satellite imagery has revealed faint rectilinear patterns under the alluvium in areas south of modern-day Nasiriyah. These could be natural formations, or they could be the outlines of a drowned city. But until excavations can be conducted, the question remains unresolved. And then there is the most contentious possibility that Bad-tibira did not vanish naturally. Some scholars, working at the fringes of archaeology, suggest that the city's disappearance aligns with a pattern seen across other ancient sites: sudden abandonment, buried architecture, a gap in material culture, as if something forced entire populations to flee or relocate abruptly. The King List implies continuity between Eridu and Bad-tibira, yet the archaeological record does not. Why? What happened during those eras that left so few traces behind? The deeper one digs, the more the antediluvian age refuses to behave like a simple myth. The stories of Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, and Sippar form a narrative echoing across cultures, a memory of cities, knowledge, and catastrophic loss. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these early cities is not their technology, nor their mythology, nor their disappearance. It is their placement, because when we line up the cities of the King List on a modern map, something strange happens. They do not match the landscape we know today. Some appear shifted, others appear in locations that would have been underwater or uninhabitable. and some lie along the paths of ancient rivers that no longer exist. This brings us to one of the most puzzling anomalies in the entire narrative, the geographic paradox, a mismatch between the ancient world described in the texts and the world revealed by modern geology. And it raises a provocative question. Were the antediluvian cities built in a landscape we no longer recognize? If Eridu reveals a beginning and Bad-tibira exposes an impossible level of early mastery, the third mystery of the King List may be the most unsettling of all. Because the more we compare the ancient cities to today's landscape, the more one fact becomes unavoidable. The world described by the King List does not match the world we see now. This is the geographic paradox, a mismatch so profound that it challenges everything we assume about ancient history, environmental stability, and the continuity of human geography. For centuries, historians treated the King List as myth, yet the moment we attempt to place its cities on an actual map, an eerie realization emerges. Many of them cannot be where the texts say they were. The rivers are wrong, the coastlines are wrong, the distances are wrong. Even the terrain itself seems inconsistent, which leads to a possibility both simple and deeply unsettling. Either the King List is fiction, or the land has changed, and not gradually, catastrophically. Archaeology traditionally assumes that ancient cities remain roughly where they were, but Mesopotamia defies this expectation. Beneath its surface lies a shifting, restless landscape, one shaped by floods, shifting riverbeds, sea incursions, sediment deposition, and abrupt environmental transitions. Over thousands of years, entire regions have risen, sunk, dried, drowned, and transformed beyond recognition. But the King List complicates this further. It describes city sequences that align with patterns of river flow and resource distribution, but these patterns fit a landscape older than the one revealed by modern geology. A landscape that some researchers argue may belong to a pre-Holocene world, before the end of the last ice age. The Euphrates and Tigris once flowed differently, their channels braided, diverged, and rejoined in ways that no longer exist. Satellite imagery shows the ghost paths of extinct rivers, massive channels now buried under silt or concealed beneath highways and farms. And when researchers overlay the King List's city sequence on these lost waterways, something remarkable happens. The alignment improves. Cities that appeared out of place suddenly find logical positions along vanished riverbanks or ancient wetlands that dried up long before written history. This suggests that the King List may preserve memory not just of ancient kings, but of an ancient geography, a map of a world erased by cataclysm. Take the city of Larak. The King List names it as a major antediluvian centre, yet archaeologists have searched for it in vain. There is no confirmed site, no definitive ruins. However, remote sensing surveys have identified submerged rectilinear patterns in an area that was once connected to the Euphrates but now lies far from any active waterway. Soil studies show sudden deposition layers consistent with massive flooding. If Larak existed, it may lie buried deeper than modern archaeology typically probes. Then there is Sippar, another antediluvian city tied to mythic descriptions of vast libraries and solar worship. There is a known Sippar Amnanum, but some scholars believe the King List's Sippar predates it entirely. The earliest levels of its excavation show a sudden jump in sophistication, as if older foundations were erased or swallowed by a flooding event. Archaeologist Stephanie Daly once proposed that ancient Mesopotamia may have lost dozens of early cities due to sudden river shifts alone. When a river changed course, whole settlements were cut off from water, abandoned, or drowned under rising floodplains. Over thousands of years, the rivers moved miles away, leaving the deserts scattered with the ghosts of cities. But the King List's anomalies indicate something larger, events too abrupt or too widespread to be explained solely by rivers meandering. In some locations, the soil shows signs of turbidity deposits, massive layers of disturbed sediment consistent with tsunami-like waves or abrupt inundations. Geological studies of the Persian Gulf reveal that around the end of the last ice age, the sea surged inland repeatedly, flooding enormous portions of what is now southern Iraq. Entire deltas disappeared, only to reform centuries later. If the earlier cities stood during this unstable era, then their remains may lie beneath hundreds of feet of silt, or even under the shallow waters of the Gulf. This possibility has been quietly entertained by marine archaeologists. In the early 2000s, exploratory sonar scans along the northern Gulf indicated unusual rectilinear anomalies, right angles, walls, and mound formations consistent with human construction, but the region is politically sensitive and comprehensive underwater excavation has not been permitted. Still, the images hint at what could be a drowned landscape, one that once belonged to the people who wrote, or preserved, the stories of the antediluvian age. But the geographic paradox does not end in Mesopotamia. When the global distribution of ancient flood myths is considered, Greece, India, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, a pattern emerges. Many of the first cities described in these traditions also seem displaced, submerged, or lost to time. Civilizations from across the planet remember cities swept away, mountains rising, coastlines shifting, and rivers rerouted in a single generation. The King List may simply be the most explicit historical record of this transformation, yet perhaps the most haunting detail is this. None of the antediluvian cities listed, none, have been fully excavated or definitively located to match their descriptions. The earliest layers of Eridu are reachable, but the deeper one goes, the more the evidence dissolves, as if the roots of the city lie not just beneath soil, but beneath epochs. The paradox extends beyond lost cities. It reaches into the architecture itself. Foundations appear too deep. Layers of habitation sit below what should have been waterlogged ground. Some structures are oriented in ways that make sense only in an older climate, when prevailing winds, water tables, or coastlines were different. What the King List describes is not merely old. It is from a world rearranged, a world whose shape, climate, and geography were altered so dramatically that modern maps cannot help us trace its cities. This raises a troubling possibility. The Great Flood described across cultures may not have been a single event, but the final surge in a series of dramatic transformations that reshaped the region. If the antediluvian cities stood before the final collapse of the Ice Age, then the King List may preserve the last coherent memory of a landscape now buried beneath deserts, rivers, and seas. Which brings us to the next question. If the land changed so drastically, what does that imply about the people who built the first cities? What knowledge did they possess? What tools? What techniques? The further we follow the King List, the more we encounter descriptions of skills and technologies that seem out of place for their time. And so, we turn to another dimension of the mystery, the technological anomalies of the antediluvian cities, structures, tools, and engineering feats that should not have existed in the earliest chapters of human history. If the geography of the King List suggests a world reshaped, then its engineering hints at something even more profound, a level of sophistication inconsistent with the earliest chapters of human civilization. The ruins of the antediluvian cities, fragmentary though they are, contain puzzles that standard archaeological narratives struggle to explain. These are not the marks of simple village communities learning to build. They are the fingerprints of planners, artisans, and engineers whose knowledge appears too advanced, too refined, and too sudden to fit comfortably within the framework of the Neolithic world. To understand this mystery, we must begin not with what has been found, but with what should not exist. Archaeology expects the earliest cities to display crude construction, rough walls, irregular bricks, organic materials that decay quickly. But the foundational layers of Eridu, Sippar, and other early sites reveal uniformity. Brick dimensions standardized, alignments consistent, layouts that seem intentionally oriented. This is not what one expects from communities supposedly experimenting with architecture for the first time. Consider the earliest temple at Eridu. Its floor plan is symmetrical, with a central platform, a recessed offering space, and a tripartite structure that would become the hallmark of later Sumerian design. Yet here it appears already developed, already mature, as though someone had provided a template rather than a prototype. Archaeologists call this the first temple, but nothing about it feels like a first attempt. There is no evolutionary sequence of trial and error. The earliest phase is already functional, aligned, and ceremonially sophisticated. Similarly, the earliest levels of Bad-tibira, though not yet excavated definitively, are described in Sumerian literature as centers of craftsmanship and metallurgy. Metallurgy should not appear in this period at all, let alone at a level advanced enough to define a city's identity. Even if the mythic descriptions exaggerate, they raise an unavoidable question. Why would the earliest people imagine their own ancestors as metalworkers? Myths, after all, usually inflate traits that have some historical basis. Even Shuruppak, traditionally associated with the final king before the flood, displays structures of surprising complexity. The city's drainage systems, ancient canals, and evidence of organized urban planning challenge the notion that early Mesopotamians were learning as they went. These are the hallmarks of people who knew how cities should function. People with rules, standards, and a shared architectural language. And then there is the matter of scale. The early inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia constructed canals wide enough to require coordinated labor and long-term planning. They redirected water across great distances. They created raised platforms to escape seasonal floods, platforms built from compacted earth, and millions of mud bricks laid with consistency and purpose. How did societies with simple tools achieve this level of organization? One might argue that these developments emerged naturally from agricultural surpluses and social complexity, but the chronology makes that explanation less convincing. The standard model suggests cities develop after agriculture has matured. Yet in Mesopotamia, the archaeological record shows early urbanization occurring extremely quickly, so quickly that many anthropologists refer to it as the urban revolution. But revolutions, by definition, do not emerge gradually. They erupt, sudden, unanticipated, as if triggered by an idea, a system, or a blueprint introduced from outside. This is where the King List becomes provocative. It claims that kingship, organization, administration, centralized authority, was not invented by the Sumerians, but descended from a prior source. Myths attribute its origin to divine beings, but if one strips away the mythological language, what remains is the assertion that knowledge entered Sumer fully formed. In Eridu, the earliest pottery shows advanced symmetry even before the appearance of potter's wheels. In the region surrounding ancient Bad-tibira, archaeologists have found fragments of metal artifacts predating the expected timeline for metallurgy. They are small, they are rare, but they exist. These cannot be dismissed as trade items from distant cultures because no nearby civilization had such capabilities at the time. The deeper researchers dig, literally and figuratively, the more questions multiply. Why do early Sumerian measurements correspond so closely with later standardized units? Why does the architecture of the earliest cities already contain the elements associated with later ziggurats? Why do so many early myths describe advanced tools, weapons, and instruments used by the antediluvian kings? Of course, myths are not evidence, but they are often echoes of something, memories distorted over time, encoded in symbolism. The mythic artisans, the divine blacksmiths, the instructors of kings, could these stories reflect an elite priestly class inheriting knowledge from a lost lineage? This interpretation becomes still more compelling when one considers the sudden disappearance of certain early technologies. Some early pottery forms vanish abruptly after the flood-era layers. Some construction techniques disappear only to reappear centuries later. It is as though knowledge was lost, partially remembered, then slowly rediscovered. The flood layers themselves tell a silent story. In Shuruppak, in Ur, in Kish, in multiple sites across the region, archaeologists have found thick deposits of fine clay, indicating a massive inundation that swept across southern Mesopotamia. Above these layers, architecture becomes simpler, cruder, less coordinated, as though something significant had been forgotten. Yet the King List insists that 8 cities existed before this flood, and that they possessed rulers whose achievements stretched across millennia. If these rulers were mythological exaggerations, why do their cities display evidence of planning and sophistication that does not correspond to their supposed time period? Some researchers propose that the antediluvian cities were built, at least in part, using techniques inherited from an earlier civilization lost during the meltdown of the last ice age, when rising sea levels drowned vast coastal regions across the world. If Mesopotamia preserved even fragments of that older knowledge, it could explain the sudden appearance of urban principles otherwise absent in the archaeological sequence. This hypothesis remains controversial, but it gains weight with each discovery that contradicts the standard timeline. The King List might not be literal, but it may preserve the memory of an era when human society was more organized than we think, an era erased by catastrophe, leaving only stories and fragmented ruins behind. But the strongest evidence of something extraordinary comes from comparing the early Mesopotamian record to other ancient civilizations. Again and again, we encounter the same pattern: sudden development, sophisticated engineering, and inexplicable decline, as though humanity keeps rediscovering what it once knew. Which brings us to the broader question: were the antediluvian cities isolated miracles, or part of something larger? We turn outward, beyond Sumer, beyond Mesopotamia, to examine civilizations across the world that preserve their own memories of ancient cities, cities destroyed by flood, fire, or the heavens, yet described with uncanny similarity. This is where the mystery of the King List becomes global. If the Sumerian King List stood alone, it might be dismissed as myth, exaggeration, or the artifact of an imaginative culture. But it does not stand alone. Across the world, on continents separated by oceans and millennia, civilizations with no apparent contact describe stories that echo the same sequence: an age of great cities, an era of advanced knowledge, and a catastrophic flood that ended it all. This is where the mystery grows from curious to global. By the time the Sumerians carved their King List into clay, stories of a world before the flood were already ancient. Yet similar stories appear everywhere, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the jungles of Central America, from the mountains of Peru to the river valleys of India and China. And when we compare these myths, the parallels are so striking that coincidence becomes increasingly improbable. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis, a maritime empire with monumental architecture, complex engineering, and a social order that collapsed in a single day and night of fire and flood. Plato's account, though often treated as allegory, presents a civilization existing long before the rise of Greece, just as the Sumerians remembered their antediluvian cities. In Egypt, priests told Herodotus that their history stretched back 11,000 years, far beyond what archaeologists once believed possible. They described Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled on earth, cities flourished along the Nile, and knowledge was handed down from beings who came before the flood. These tales mirror the structure of the King List precisely: a divine age, a list of early rulers, and a civilization reset by catastrophe. In India, The Mahabharata and the Puranas recount a golden age of ancient cities, Dvaraka, Ayodhya, Lanka, cities with advanced architecture, flying machines, weapons of terrifying power, and complex social institutions. These accounts do not depict humanity as primitive. They portray an early age of sophistication, repeatedly destroyed by floods and cosmic upheavals. The Andes tell a similar story. The Inca spoke of Tiwanaku as older than memory itself, built by gods in a time before the deluge. Archaeologists once believed the site was only around 1,500 years old, but in the 20th century, researchers discovered evidence that parts of the complex could be far older, perhaps predating the last ice age. Megalithic blocks weighing dozens of tons lie scattered, as if a massive force tore the city apart. In North America, Hopi, Navajo, and other indigenous nations preserve the memory of multiple worlds, previous ages destroyed by water, fire, ice, and earth. The same pattern repeats: an early age of order and knowledge, a fall, and a rebirth. The Aztec Five Suns story captures this almost perfectly, describing successive creations and destructions of the world. None of these cultures knew the Sumerians, none had access to the King List. And yet the stories align. Skeptics argue that flood myths are universal because floods are common. But these traditions contain far more detail than simple survival stories. They describe cities with names, rulers with identities, systems of architecture, religious orders, and knowledge that disappears after the catastrophe. They preserve genealogies, chronologies, and geographical references. They speak of ruins beneath the sea, of sacred mountains where knowledge was preserved, of cities built by forgotten peoples. Most importantly, these stories describe not merely a flood, but a transformation of the world itself, coastlines shifting, rivers rerouting, lands rising and sinking, the old geography replaced by the new. This is exactly what the geographic paradox in the King List suggests. Could these global traditions be independent memories of the same event? Some researchers believe so. The end of the last ice age was not a slow thawing, but a turbulent sequence of climatic upheavals. Glacial meltwater pulses raised sea levels by hundreds of feet within short periods. Some coastal regions were swallowed whole. If early civilizations existed near coastlines, as most do, they would have been erased. Sumerian traditions say the first cities were built near vast wetlands and river deltas. Egyptian traditions say their earliest temples once stood on land now submerged. Indian traditions recall citadels destroyed by rising seas. Japanese coastal legends speak of drowned kingdoms. Polynesian myth remembers islands lost to the ocean. And then there are the underwater ruins. Off the coast of India, at the Gulf of Kambhat, sonar scans have revealed grid-like structures, stone blocks, and what some believe could be remnants of a 9,000-year-old city, predating the Indus Valley civilization. Off Yonaguni in Japan, divers discovered massive stepped formations that resemble megalithic terraces. In the Mediterranean, structures near Malta and Sicily appear older than the pyramids. Off the coast of Cuba, anomalous stone blocks arranged in geometric patterns were found 600 meters underwater. These discoveries remain controversial. Some may be natural formations. Others remain unexplored due to political or technical limitations. But their existence raises a profound question. How many ancient cities lie beneath the sea, lost not to erosion, but to a cataclysm powerful enough to drown entire landscapes? And why do so many ancient cultures insist that before the flood, humanity was more advanced? This does not mean advanced in a modern technological sense, but advanced in organization, engineering, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, far beyond what textbooks typically attribute to prehistoric societies. The King List fits perfectly into this global mosaic. Its narrative mirrors the stories of distant peoples. Its structure echoes their chronologies. Its cities resemble their lost cities. Its flood parallels their floods. Its antediluvian rulers mirror their Golden Age kings and god-kings. All these connections suggest that the King List may contain a fragment of a larger global memory. Not a single civilization, but many. Not a single empire, but a network of early cultures shaped by shared challenges and disasters. Perhaps the antediluvian age was not a mere Sumerian myth, but a worldwide epoch, one poorly preserved, poorly understood, and mostly forgotten. And if so, then the King List is more than a record. It is a time capsule pointing toward an age when humanity, or whatever form humanity took, was already building, organizing, and creating long before the supposed dawn of civilization. But this brings us to the next question. If these early societies shared memories, myths, and catastrophic histories across continents, then what does that imply about their origins? And even more unsettling, what does that imply about us? We explore the possibility that the antediluvian age represents not the beginning of human civilization, but the end of a much older chapter, one that forces us to rethink human origins entirely. If the global echoes of the antediluvian cities hint at a shared memory, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly are we remembering? The more we compare ancient traditions, flood myths, and archaeological anomalies, the more a troubling possibility emerges. A possibility that challenges every timeline, every chronology, every assumption about human beginnings. The possibility that we are missing an entire chapter of humanity's story. The conventional timeline of civilization is clear and comfortable. Agriculture arises around 10,000 BCE. Villages become towns. Towns become cities. Cities form states. Writing emerges. Kings appear. Everything builds upward in a slow, predictable curve. But the deeper we dig, both figuratively and literally, that curve begins to distort. Knowledge appears too early. Engineering appears too suddenly. Myths appear too consistent. And the King List refuses to fit anywhere within that neat and orderly structure. Its earliest rulers live for tens of thousands of years. Its earliest cities appear before agriculture should be widespread. Its chronology spans an age that mainstream archaeology barely recognizes. Yet the King List is not alone in claiming such vast stretches of time. Egyptian priest Manetho described dynasties ruled by gods and demigods for thousands of years before the pharaohs. Indian texts speak of yugas, ages lasting tens of thousands of years, each with its own rulers, civilizations and technologies. The Maya counted time in cycles spanning millions of years. Chinese legends describe emperors ruling for centuries, teaching humanity, agriculture, medicine, and astronomy before recorded history. Around the world, civilizations insist that history stretches far beyond the boundaries accepted by modern science. And yet archaeology struggles to accept these claims because the physical evidence appears sparse, fragmented, lost beneath sediments, or drowned beneath seas. But perhaps the problem is not the lack of evidence. Perhaps the problem is our assumption that civilization began recently and must therefore appear suddenly in the archaeological record. What if civilization did not begin in 3000 BCE? What if it collapsed in 10,000 BCE? Suddenly, the King List makes more sense. Its vast lifespans become symbolic markers of epochs rather than literal years. Its succession of pre-flood cities becomes the memory of a network of early settlements wiped out by a climatic catastrophe. Its flood becomes the Younger Dryas event, a dramatic global meltdown roughly 12,000 years ago that ended the Ice Age. During that period, sea levels rose by over 120 meters. Entire coastlines vanished. Any civilization living near the sea would have been erased without a trace. Today, 90% of humanity lives near coasts. If the same were true at the end of the Ice Age, then the ruins of that world lie underwater, beyond the reach of easy discovery. This aligns uncannily well with the King List structure. An age of cities, a cataclysmic flood, a restart. The same pattern appears in Plato's Atlantis, in Egypt's Zep-Tepi, in the Indian flood of Manu, in the Sumerian flood of Ziusudra, in the biblical flood of Noah. All describe an ancient world destroyed, followed by a reset. If we consider these traditions as fragmented memories of a prehistoric epoch, then the standard timeline becomes not wrong, but incomplete. It recounts only the most recent cycle of civilization, the one that began after the flood. The King List preserves the previous cycle, but if that cycle existed, then who lived in it? What were they capable of? How advanced were they? Here the evidence becomes tantalizing. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered a temple complex dated to around 9600 BCE, long before agriculture should have been established. Yet the builders carved massive T-shaped pillars weighing tons, arranged in circles with precise alignments. They carved reliefs of animals, symbols, patterns, and astronomical imagery. The site is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by 7,000. It should not exist, and yet it does. Tiwanaku in the Andes displays stonework so precise that razor blades can pass between its joints. Some blocks weigh up to 100 tons. The site's astronomical alignments indicate an age that may predate its accepted construction by thousands of years. In Southeast Asia, the massive temple mountain of Gunung Padang appears to have layers far older than the topmost structures, possibly extending back before 10,000 BCE. These are not isolated anomalies. They are scattered puzzle pieces, and the King List may be one of the only surviving documents that still remembers the picture those pieces once formed. It is as though humanity has passed through cycles, rising to complexity, falling to catastrophe, rising again. In each cycle, knowledge is carried forward only partially, fractured into myth, encoded into ritual, buried in architecture, or preserved in stone lists of kings whose reigns stretch across forgotten ages. But if this hidden timeline is real, as the King List seems to insist, then the next question becomes even more unsettling. What exactly ended the previous cycle? The ancient texts all agree on one thing: a cataclysm, a flood. But floods do not simply erase knowledge. They erase landscapes, they erase coastlines, they erase cities, and they erase clues. Yet geology records events capable of such destruction. Meltwater pulses, glacial outburst floods, sudden sea level surges, comet impacts, volcanic eruptions on unprecedented scales. Any of these could have reshaped the world so completely that only the highest, safest, or most inland regions preserved fragments of earlier societies. That is why Mesopotamia may hold a unique position in the story. It is not the oldest civilization. It is the oldest recovered civilization. The King List may be the first attempt to reconstruct a past already lost. Its compilers, writing thousands of years after the events, may have been preserving memories inherited from traditions far older than themselves. And the antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, may have been outposts of a civilization that survived just long enough to rebuild before the flood finally consumed them. This hidden timeline does not just expand history, it reframes civilization as a repeating phenomenon, not a single ascent. But if this is true, then one aspect of the King List becomes particularly intriguing: its detailed account of knowledge, engineered knowledge, embedded in the earliest cities. Which leads us to the next question. What exactly did the ancient builders know? And how advanced were their tools, methods, and sciences? In the next part, we examine the technological anomalies hinted at in early texts and ruins. clues that suggest the first cities may have inherited engineering principles, astronomical knowledge, and organizational systems far older than the civilizations that recorded them. If humanity truly lived through earlier cycles, if a world existed before the Great Flood, then the most important question is not about the cities that vanished, nor the kings whose reigns stretch beyond imagination, but the knowledge they carried, knowledge that arrived fully formed in the earliest layers of civilization, knowledge that should have taken millennia to develop, but instead appears at the very beginning of recorded history, like a memory resurfacing after a long silence. The Sumerians themselves were clear. They did not invent their civilization. They inherited it. They insisted that writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and kingship were gifts, brought to them, taught to them, or restored to them after an age of destruction. And when we examine the archaeological and textual evidence closely, the story becomes far more complex than the standard narrative suggests. To understand this legacy, we must start with something deceptively simple: the sudden sophistication of early Sumerian knowledge. Consider their mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, sexagesimal, that remains today in our measurement of time and geometry. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. It is an elegant system, mathematically superior to base 10 in many ways, yet inexplicably advanced for its era. There is no evolutionary pathway that explains its origin. It appears fully formed in the earliest records. Likewise, Sumerian astronomy is shockingly precise for such an early date. They track the movements of stars, planets, and lunar cycles with accuracy that would not be matched for thousands of years. Their star catalogues align with constellations known worldwide, and some contain data suggesting astronomical observations far older than their civilization. Where did this knowledge come from? Traditional scholarship avoids this question, assuming the Sumerians developed advanced mathematics and astronomy independently. Yet the timeline defies this explanation. Writing emerges suddenly. Mathematics appears without precursor forms. Astronomical systems arrive fully structured. Agriculture, expected to evolve slowly, shows signs of intensive management from its earliest appearance. This is not the signature of incremental development. It is the signature of inheritance. The King List, in its enigmatic simplicity, may be describing not kings with literal millennia-long lives, but custodians of knowledge stretching back across forgotten ages. Each antediluvian ruler may represent an era, an epoch passed down as memory from a world that vanished. Evidence for inherited knowledge does not stop with the Sumerians. Ancient Egypt displays the same pattern. The earliest pyramids appear too perfect to be prototypes. Zep-Tepi traditions claim civilization was restored, not invented. Indian texts describe cities with advanced social structures at the dawn of their recorded history. Mesoamerican civilizations inherited calendrical systems more sophisticated than their material culture would suggest. Again and again, the same pattern emerges. Early civilizations behave like rebuilders, not innovators. But what exactly are they rebuilding? Let us consider engineering. The earliest Mesopotamian cities display canal systems, standardized brick production, and advanced water management. These are not traits expected from a culture just learning to settle. They are the traits of people who understand urban design deeply enough to implement it immediately. In Egypt, the earliest monumental architecture appears abruptly, without transitional stages. In the Indus Valley, city planning reaches an astonishing level. Grid layouts, drainage systems, standardized weights, before suddenly disappearing. At Göbekli Tepe, megalithic structures rise in a world that officially should not have engineers. None of these sites fit into a clean, linear model of technological evolution. But if an earlier world existed, one with its own knowledge, its own cities, its own cultures, then these anomalies make sense. The survivors of the cataclysm carried fragments of memory with them, not the tools themselves, not the machines, but the concepts, the principles, passed orally across generations. Imagine a world devastated by flooding. Survivors forced inland, away from the drowned coastlines where their cities once stood. Over time they rebuild with simpler materials, simpler tools, but with memories of what once was, how cities were organized, how temples were aligned to the stars, how water was controlled and redirected. They possess knowledge but lack the infrastructure to execute it as before. And so the earliest cities of the post-flood world contain echoes, not replicas, of a lost age. This explains why knowledge appears out of phase with material culture, why early societies know how to build sophisticated systems long before they have the means to do so, why myths worldwide describe teachers, civilizers, and god-kings descending after the flood to reorganize humanity. The King List preserves this pattern exactly. 8 antediluvian cities, each ruled by a figure of immense longevity, and then a great flood, followed by shorter reigns, simpler structures, and a world rebuilt from fragments. But this raises another question. What kind of knowledge survives catastrophe? What principles endure even when technology fails? Astronomy, mathematics, sacred geometry, water engineering, these are conceptual sciences that can be taught without machines. They can survive orally. They can be remembered in myth, ritual, and architecture, and that is exactly where they appear. The earliest temples encode astronomical alignments. Early cities embed geometric ratios. Early myths describe the origins of agriculture, metallurgy, and construction not as inventions but as restorations. Consider the agricultural mystery. Domesticated crops appear suddenly across the Near East around 10,000 BCE. Wheat, barley, legumes, genetically transformed in ways that would normally require long-term selection or deliberate engineering. Yet the Sumerians attribute agriculture not to experimentation, but to instruction, gifts from gods or from beings who survived the flood. Some geneticists have proposed that early domestication may indeed require a level of intervention inconsistent with trial and error farming. Yet the archaeological narrative still frames early agriculture as an independent discovery. But what if it was not? What if early farmers already knew the principles but lacked the infrastructure to cultivate on a large scale until the climate stabilized? This fits the pattern of a world rebuilding itself. And then there is writing. The earliest Sumerian writing is not primitive. It is structured, systematized, organized around accounting, astronomy, timekeeping, and administration. Why would the first written records center on topics requiring advanced knowledge? Why not simple narratives, personal stories, or ritual texts? It is as though writing was developed to preserve something already complex. Administrative systems, calendars, and celestial cycles inherited from an older era. Again, the King List fits perfectly. It is not a simple myth. It is a record of the world before the flood, preserved in writing to maintain continuity after the cataclysm. But this raises a deeper question. If knowledge was inherited, if cities were rebuilt, if astronomy was remembered, then where are the physical remains of the world that came before? This leads us to the next stage of the mystery. The drowned ruins, buried structures, and forgotten landscapes that may hold the physical evidence of the antediluvian age, hidden not in Mesopotamia alone, but across the world. If the King List preserves the memory of an older world, then the natural question follows. Where are the cities of that world now? Where is antediluvian Eridu in its full form? Where is Bad-tibira, the city of the metalworkers? Where are Larak, Sippar, and the others that the list claims existed before the flood? For centuries, these questions lingered without answers. Archaeologists focused on cities visible above ground, those whose walls still protruded from the desert or whose ruins had survived the passage of millennia. But the antediluvian cities are different. They are older than memory, older than myth, older than the civilizations that wrote about them. They do not lie in the open. They are buried, drowned, erased, or transformed by forces far older than written history. And in the last 50 years, new technologies, remote sensing, sonar mapping, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, have begun to reveal a startling truth. The world is far more filled with buried cities than anyone imagined. Let us begin with Mesopotamia itself. To the untrained eye, the southern Iraqi plain appears empty, flat, dry, featureless. But the ground beneath this region is a palimpsest, a layered text written and rewritten by rivers, floods, droughts, and shifting coastlines. Archaeologists now estimate that tens of thousands of ancient sites exist in Iraq, most of them unexplored. More than 80% remain unexcavated, and many others are invisible, buried beneath up to 20 meters of silt. Using satellite imagery, researchers have discovered the faint outlines of lost canals, forgotten river channels, submerged settlements, and rectangular building foundations stretching across hundreds of kilometers. In some regions, the landscape appears almost entirely artificial, constructed by human hands thousands of years before the first recorded empire. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in the early 2000s, when high-resolution satellite imagery revealed the remnants of an enormous canal network, far older than any known Mesopotamian dynasty. Some segments are almost perfectly straight for miles, something impossible without advanced surveying. These canals do not match the known historical periods. They appear older, perhaps far older, than even the earliest Sumerian cities. Could they be remnants of the antediluvian world? Closer to the Persian Gulf, the evidence grows even more compelling. As sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, large portions of the Mesopotamian coast were swallowed. Marine archaeologists exploring the northern Gulf have detected structures on the seabed, rectangular formations, linear walls, elevated mounds, buried beneath centuries of sediment. Some appear to be massive, measuring hundreds of meters across. Others resemble the foundations of temples or administrative buildings. The political instability of the region has made deep exploration difficult. But the sonar scans are intriguing. They hint at architecture beneath the water, architecture that predates Phoenicia, Sumer, and Akkad. If these structures belong to the lost antediluvian cities, then the King List may not be myth at all. It may be a map pointing to a drowned coastline. Yet the evidence is not confined to Mesopotamia. The story is global. In the Gulf of Kambat in western India, underwater surveys revealed an enormous area of sunken structures spanning several kilometers. Columns, geometric patterns, worked stone, all sitting on a seabed that was dry land before 7000 BCE. Some carbon samples from the region date back to nearly 9,000 years ago, older than the Indus Valley civilization. While not fully confirmed, the scale of the site is extraordinary. If it proves to be a prehistoric city, it would be one of the oldest ever discovered, and one submerged so deeply that only modern sonar could find it. Near Japan's Yonaguni Island lies another underwater mystery: massive terraces carved with right angles and stair-like platforms. Scientists are divided over whether Yonaguni's formations are natural or artificially modified. But the shapes, smooth plains, orthogonal cuts, even what appear to be roads, suggest at minimum that human craftsmanship may have played a role. In the Mediterranean, sonar has revealed circular stone structures off the coast of Malta, older than its famous megalithic temples. Near Alexandria, Egypt, the ancient city of Heraklion was found perfectly preserved underwater, proving that entire urban centres can indeed be lost to the sea and remain undiscovered for millennia. And then there is the Caribbean. Off the coast of Cuba, at a depth of more than 600 meters, researchers detected massive blocks arranged in geometric grids. The structures lie far deeper than any known post-Ice Age settlement could have sunk through natural means. If they are artificial, and this remains debated, they would belong to a time when sea level was dramatically lower. Taken individually, these discoveries are puzzles. Taken together, they form a pattern. Across the world, we find ruins at depth suggesting they were built before the rapid sea level rise of the last Ice Age meltdown. We find cities buried beneath layers of silt deposited by ancient floods. We find monumental structures that appear as fragments of an earlier age, erased by catastrophe. The King List does not stand alone. It fits into this global trend, an encoded record of a world that once existed but is now fragmented across continents and ocean floors. This raises a deeper question. If the antediluvian world existed, what did it look like? How widespread were its cities? And how advanced was it? To answer that, we must consider not just what has been found, but what has not been found. Many lost cities may lie beneath deserts. The Sahara hosts dozens of buried riverbeds, some large enough to have supported ancient civilizations. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed entire megalithic structures near the Tassili Plateau, still unexcavated. In Arabia, the sands conceal the outlines of enormous ancient settlements whose origins remain unknown. Other cities may lie beneath jungles. LiDAR scans in Central America have revealed cities 10 times larger than expected, connected by superhighway-like causeways. In Cambodia, LiDAR uncovered the lost city of Mahendraparvata beneath dense foliage, proof that tropical environments can hide vast urban landscapes. If this is true, then the antediluvian cities of the King List may remain undiscovered, not because they never existed, but because we are only now developing the technology to find them. And that leads us to the next chapter of this documentary. If the physical remains of the antediluvian age still lie hidden beneath Earth's surface, what might they reveal when we uncover them? In the next part, we examine the cutting-edge technologies that are finally allowing archaeologists to peel back the layers of time and reveal cities long thought to be myth. Technologies that may soon confirm whether the King List was memory, exaggeration, or truth preserved across 10,000 years. For thousands of years, the world before the flood lived in the shadows of legend. Its cities were regarded as metaphors. Its kings were dismissed as impossibly long-lived. Its engineering was considered myth. But something remarkable is happening. For the first time in human history, we possess the tools to see beneath the ground, beneath the sea, beneath the deserts, beneath the jungles. And the picture emerging is radically different from the one we inherited. The King List may have waited 5 millennia for this moment. The story begins with a shift in archaeology itself. For most of the discipline's history, excavation meant digging. Slow, destructive, limited. Archaeologists could investigate only what they could physically reach. Entire civilizations lay invisible, simply because they were buried too deeply or covered by terrain too hostile to explore. But today's technologies allow us to scan landscapes without touching them, and that is where the real breakthroughs have begun. One of the most transformative tools is LiDAR, light detection and ranging. Initially developed for military and aerospace use, LiDAR fires millions of laser pulses from aircraft and measures their return times, effectively stripping away forests, vegetation, and surface debris. What remains is a pure digital model of the land beneath. With this tool, archaeologists in Guatemala uncovered the largest ancient civilization ever found in the Americas. Thousands of buildings, causeways, canals, terraces, and pyramids hidden under jungle canopy. In Cambodia, LiDAR revealed the sprawling urban footprint of Angkor Wat's greater metropolis, proving that an immense city lay buried beneath centuries of overgrowth. And if cities this massive could vanish beneath trees in just a few centuries, what could vanish beneath 10,000 years of silt, deserts, or rising seas? Next comes ground-penetrating radar, GPR, a technology that sends electromagnetic pulses into the soil and maps subsurface anomalies. GPR has revealed buried rooms beneath the pyramids, stone structures beneath the Sahara, and entire settlement grids beneath European farmlands. Some results are astonishing. In the Mesopotamian plain, GPR and magnetometry surveys have revealed geometric patterns, rectangular foundations, canal systems, and building clusters, at depths far greater than expected for historical sites. Some of these anomalies appear to predate all known Mesopotamian layers. Still deeper are mysteries detected by SAR, synthetic aperture radar waves capable of penetrating dry sand, and even certain types of desert bedrock. NASA's radar experiments over the Sahara have revealed lost river systems dozens of kilometers wide. One such river, now entirely buried, once flowed across northern Africa and may have supported human settlements tens of thousands of years ago. The Sahara, once green, has swallowed entire worlds. Under its dunes may lie ruins whose age matches the antediluvian period described in the King List. But the ocean hides even more. Multi-beam sonar, used primarily for submarine navigation, has revealed structures on continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age. Off the coasts of India, Japan, Malta, and Cuba, sonar maps show terraces, rectilinear formations, and stone blocks at depths far below what any known civilization experienced naturally. Some of these structures could be natural, others artificial, but the simple fact that they exist, far below modern sea level, aligns perfectly with the global flooding events recorded in ancient myth. And then there is satellite imagery. For decades it was used for meteorology and navigation, but now it serves as a global archaeological scanner. High-resolution satellites can detect crop marks, subtle changes in vegetation caused by buried structures. They can trace ancient rivers. They can map soil disturbances invisible to the human eye. Using this technology, researchers have discovered hundreds of previously unknown pyramids in Egypt, hundreds of lost settlements in the Amazon, and countless archaeological sites across the Middle East. It is now estimated that our planet may contain over 1 million unexcavated archaeological sites, most of them completely invisible until the last decade. All this matters because the King List describes cities so old that their remains would not lie near the surface. These cities would be the deepest, the most buried, the most eroded, the most transformed by catastrophe. They would be the hardest to find until now. Imagine scanning the Mesopotamian plain with satellite sensors calibrated to detect stone foundations beneath 10 meters of silt. Imagine mapping the Persian Gulf floor with sonar capable of resolving structures at half-kilometer depths. Imagine using ice-penetrating radar, the same technology that discovered hidden lakes under Antarctica, to map ancient landscapes trapped beneath deserts. For the first time, we can do all of this, and with each passing year, the results align more and more closely with the possibility that a forgotten world existed, not just in Sumer, but globally. The King List may be a rare written remnant of that world. The myths may be distorted memories of it. The ruins we find today, misaligned, anomalous, inexplicably old, may be its final fingerprints. But perhaps the most powerful tool is not technological at all. It is perspective. For generations, archaeology looked for human progress. Now it is beginning to look for human loss, for evidence not of invention, but reinvention. This shift in viewpoint matters. It reshapes the questions we ask. It allows us to see early civilizations not as beginners, but as survivors. And when we reframe the search this way, the anomalies become clues. The unexplained becomes meaningful. The myths become history. and the king list becomes a memory of kings who ruled in a world reshaped by forces we barely understand. A memory of cities built on landscapes we can no longer recognize. A memory of knowledge preserved through catastrophe, carried into the post-flood world by those who refuse to let it die. But all of this leads to the final question, the one that underlies this entire journey. If this forgotten world existed, what would its rediscovery mean for us? How would it change our understanding of human origins, our identity, and our future? In the next and final part, we explore the implications, scientific, historical, and existential, of uncovering the lost cities of the King List and what their revelation could mean for the story of humanity itself. If the Sumerian King List contains echoes of a forgotten world, if the buried cities, the drowned landscapes, the global myths, and the engineering anomalies are pieces of a single puzzle, then we must confront the possibility that the story we tell about human origins is incomplete, perhaps radically so. For centuries, our narrative has been linear. Humanity begins small, scattered, primitive. Over time, knowledge accumulates, cities rise, states form, writing appears, history begins. But if the antediluvian world existed, even in fragments, then this linear story collapses. In its place emerges something cyclical, older, more mysterious. A story in which the civilizations we know are not the beginning, but the beginning again. This is not a claim of lost super technologies or vanished empires of impossible power. The truth, if anything, is more subtle and far more profound, because what emerges from the King List and from the archaeological anomalies is not a story of ancient machines, but of ancient memory. The memory of cities built along forgotten rivers, kings ruling across forgotten ages, knowledge preserved through forgotten catastrophes, and people, real people, who lived, built, organized, and dreamed before the world we know was even born. If the King List is a preserved fragment of this deeper history, then its importance cannot be overstated. It becomes the oldest surviving historical document not because it describes kings, but because it describes a world both lost and remembered. A world that endured a catastrophe so total that its geography, its architecture, and its people disappeared beneath water, silt, and time. Yet its memory endured in stories, in myths, in stone, and in clay tablets written thousands of years later. Humanity remembered, even if only in fragments, and today, for the first time in the modern age, the fragments are beginning to connect. Imagine for a moment what the confirmation of this lost world would mean. Archaeologists uncovering foundations beneath the Persian Gulf that match the King List's cities. Sonar revealing vast structures older than the earliest dynasties. LiDAR tracing the outlines of forgotten settlements beneath deserts and jungles. Genetic studies showing migrations that predate agriculture. Mythology aligning with geology. Civilizations once thought primitive revealed as heirs to a far older tradition. The implications would ripple through every discipline. History would no longer begin at Sumer or Egypt. Anthropology would no longer treat early humans as slow learners. Archaeology would no longer search for the first city, but the first recovery. Mythology would no longer be fiction, but encoded memory. And humanity would no longer be a young species fumbling toward knowledge, but a species that has risen, fallen, and risen again. It would change the way we view the past. It would change the way we view ourselves. And it would change what we believe is possible. But the implications extend beyond science and scholarship. They reach into the psychological core of our identity. If the world before the flood existed, then we are the descendants not of the first builders, but the survivors of the last collapse. The inheritors of broken traditions, the keepers of forgotten knowledge, the children of a world lost to water and time. This narrative transforms our understanding of human resilience. It paints us not as passive beneficiaries of evolutionary progress, but as a species capable of rebuilding civilization after catastrophe. It reframes the ancient kings not as mythical beings, but as leaders who guided humanity through the darkness of a shattered world. It casts the earliest scribes as archivists preserving the last memories of an age no longer accessible. It gives new meaning to the flood myths that appear in every culture, warnings, lessons, reminders of how fragile civilization truly is. And it forces us to ask a new question, one more unsettling than any before. If humanity has lived through cycles of rise and fall, what cycle are we in now? Modern civilization is vast, powerful, and interconnected. But it is also fragile, dependent on complex systems, vulnerable to climate, geology, technology, and the behavior of the planet itself. The story of the antediluvian world, if real, is not simply a matter of archaeology. It is a message, a memory of what can happen when the world changes faster than humanity can adapt. The flood myths are not simply warnings of water. They are reminders that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are temporary. Landscapes shift, climates change, seas rise. What was once land becomes ocean. What was once city becomes desert. The world we know is not permanent, but this is not a pessimistic message. It is a call to awareness. Because if ancient societies survived catastrophe, rebuilt themselves, and preserved fragments of their knowledge long enough for the King List to be written, then humanity has a deeper resilience than we realize. We are not starting from nothing. We have never started from nothing. We carry within us the memory of worlds long gone. This is why the search for the antediluvian cities matters, not because they will rewrite textbooks, though they will, not because they will confirm ancient myths, though they might, but because they remind us that the past is not a straight line. It is a cycle of endurance, loss, memory, and rebirth. Humanity has walked this path before, and may walk it again. The King List is more than clay and cuneiform. It is a doorway, a bridge between two worlds, the one we know and the one we lost. And as new technologies peel back the layers of Earth, the day may come when we stand face to face with the cities of the antediluvian age. On that day, history will change forever. Until then, the lost cities wait, beneath sand, beneath sea, beneath time. Quiet, patient, ancient, waiting for us to remember them. And if this journey into the forgotten chapters of our past has resonated with you, consider supporting the exploration. A simple like, a shared thought, or subscribing to the channel helps these investigations continue, reaching others who may be searching for the same hidden stories. Thank you for traveling with us through the shadows of lost cities and vanished worlds. Your presence keeps this quest alive, and the past within reach.